Hello, I'm Ralph Klein. On the occasion of Alberta's 100th birthday, I am pleased to introduce you to the people of the Energy and Utilities Board, both past and present. This booklet that was published on the occasion of the board's 50th anniversary some 17 years ago is titled ERCB People. That was a good choice of words, because it is the people in any organization that make it work. And this is certainly the case at the Alberta Energy and Utilities Board. Without this organization overseeing development of our energy industry, things might have turned out very differently. So, as Albertans celebrate the centennial of this wonderful province, take a trip down memory lane with my friend and former colleague, Murray Dale.
Thank you, Mr. Premier. The Alberta Centennial provides an ideal opportunity to compile a history of the Alberta Energy and Utilities Board, a not-so-technical look at an organization that affects the life and livelihood of every Albertan. Here is the chairman of the board, Mr. Neil McCrank.
The Alberta Energy and Utilities Board is a marvelous organization, a world leader in many respects, unique in its past accomplishments, and with a very colorful history. That is why we at the board felt it was opportune to pause and reflect on where the EUB came from for the benefit of our staff and for the citizens of Alberta.
Alberta is blessed with a unique geological environment that is responsible for our rich inventory of natural resources. There is no place like it anywhere on Earth. Those resources include coal, gas, oil, limestone, water, and diamonds. To get a sense of the province's geological history requires a visit to an outdoor classroom, and we have one of those too. Horseshoe Canyon is only a few kilometers west of the city of Drumheller.
In the Drumheller area, you have a record of the sea approaching the land, and fluvial systems and estuarine systems. All those sediments are available in that area. You can see the coals that are there. You get a very good appreciation of geologic history and how much change can go on. At that time that those sediments were laid down, it was on a margin of a continental sea, essentially at sea level, and a very interesting time in the history of the Earth, the late Cretaceous. Of course, there's the relationship to dinosaurs, and there are a lot of interesting aspects to looking at geology in that area. It's really a classic area for looking at geology in North America.
This unique geology is responsible for Alberta's wealth of natural resources, which, as more recent history will show, required some regulation with a view to conservation. In order to explain some of the reasons why the Alberta Energy and Utilities Board was created, as usual, a picture is worth 1,000 words. This photograph of the town of Turner Valley, southwest of Calgary, was taken in 2005. Watch as we turn the clock back 80 years at exactly the same location. Dozens of rigs crammed together in order to gain quick profit resulted in waste and overproduction. The Turner Valley Gas Conservation Board tried but failed to get a handle on the problems, and that made room for a new regulatory body.
The Petroleum and Natural Gas Conservation Board, as it was known then, was the mechanism that was set up to deal with that.
Former leader of Her Majesty's Opposition, Preston Manning's father, Ernest, was instrumental in the creation of the Energy and Utilities Board and later became Premier of Alberta. He reported the issues that demanded attention in the early years included everything from the need to conserve natural gas to pro-rationing to well spacing.
And of course, all down through the years, conservation, most efficient management of reservoirs and drilling, and to try and do all of that and keep in the politics and the political patronage out of the system. That's been the mission of that board from day one. And if that hadn't been handled adequately, the province wouldn't be anywhere nearly as prosperous as it is now. So it's made a huge contribution. A lot of unspoken heroes. You won't find one Albertan in 100 that knows the background of that board or what it's saved the province from or what it's contributed.
Most oil men would agree that the board's successful struggle to maintain its political independence and impartiality over the years has been its greatest success.
Canode, as the first chairman, did a great deal to set that tone, which was carried on by other people. Doc Govier was the same type of person, Neil McKinnon, Vern Millard, all the others that came after him.
The idea of how to begin the story of the Alberta Energy and Utilities Board came to me early in 2005 as Alberta celebrated its centennial year. Former Premier Peter Louhgheed picked the arrival of the Canadian Pacific Railway in southern Alberta as the most important event in the history of the province. The year was 1883, and a CPR crew stopped at Langevin near Medicine Hat to drill for water. Before they reached the desperately needed liquid for the wheezing steam engine, they encountered natural gas. This was the beginning of Alberta's gas industry and what would become a recurring theme in the early development of Alberta's natural resources. This damn gas keeps getting in the way. Whenever it did, it was simply burned off and wasted. That is, until the EUB came along. After topping up its boiler that day, the CPR locomotive steamed off toward Calgary.
It was August the 11th, 1883, which was a big day. And to greet that locomotive when it arrived here was my grandfather, who came in with one of those push carts.
The next few years saw rapid development of the petroleum industry in Alberta. The first gas field was developed at Medicine Hat, and the first commercial oil well was drilled at Cameron Creek before Waterton became a national park. Gas was discovered at Bow Island in 1909, and 3 years later, a pipeline was built to carry the gas to heat Calgary homes. Cars were popping up on roads in southern Alberta, and just as the First World War broke out, Dingman No. 1 at Turner Valley hit a pool of gas condensate, a petroleum product so pure it could be pumped out of the ground right into the gas tank. In 1915, a regulatory board that would much later come under the umbrella of the Energy and Utilities Board was formed. The prime role of the quasi-judicial Public Utilities Board was to regulate public utilities that had been granted a monopoly to provide essential services to residents of the new province. In 1916, Peace River Oil Company's No. 1 blew out of control a few kilometers upstream from the town of Peace River. The yet-to-be-formed Alberta Energy and Utilities Board would take on the wild well several times and finally snuff it out some 87 years later. That same year, the Viking gas field was discovered, and soon a pipeline was built to carry gas from the field near Wainwright into Edmonton. In 1924, the discovery of a gas field rich in liquids ignited the second Turner Valley boom. In 1929, Carl Clark and the Alberta Research Council patented his method of extracting oil from the tar-like bitumen of Fort McMurray. The process in use today, as the Alberta oil sands explodes with investment and expansion, is based on the same hot water process Clark invented more than 75 years before. With 1930 came the most significant turning point in the history of Alberta. The federal government passed a bill giving ownership of their natural resources to Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, ensuring their financial stability well into the next millennium.
1930, before the Natural Resources Transfers Act occurred. And I can't resist this one rather personal comment. In the 70s, when I was Premier of Alberta, I was speaking in Toronto, and I was waxing about all of the resources, and I made a comment about the Natural Resource Transfers Act, and one fellow turned to the other and said, "Biggest damn mistake we ever made."
The 30s also brought the Great Depression, a period in Canadian history that gave the Alberta government little choice but to impose royalties of 5%, then 10% on oil and gas production. That move was followed by the imposition of a 2% sales tax. The hard times prompted oil companies in southern Alberta to crank up production because it was about the only source of revenue. That production resulted in enormous volumes of natural gas being wasted. Because there were no markets for it, the gas was simply flared off in places like Hell's Half Acre, which lit up the sky from Turner Valley to Calgary. Albert Bishop was a student at Crescent Heights High School in 1932 and remembers that glow in the sky.
And you could really read a newspaper any time of day or night, right on your back porch here from the flames in Turner Valley.
The new social credit government of William Aberhart decided it had to make a move to ensure orderly development of the resource, to protect the public interest, and most importantly, to stop the horrendous waste of natural gas. Ernest Manning, the then Minister of Trade and Industry, played an integral part in setting up the Alberta Petroleum and Natural Gas Conservation Board.
In the early days of the Social Credit Administration, in the 36, 38, like Turner Valley was a naphtha field, so to get the oil, you were producing all this natural gas, which in those days they didn't know what to do with. And of course, for years they'd been flaring it up to 250 million cubic feet a day.
Aside from the appalling waste of the resource, the flaring of gas at Turner Valley was causing even greater damage below ground. Allowing the gas to escape was depressurizing the geological formation, which meant that millions of barrels of oil would also be wasted because it could never be recovered. Graham Locke grew up in Turner Valley and after a successful engineering career was appointed a member of the board of the EUB in January of 2000.
By blowing your gas cap off and not maximizing the value or the ability to get the oil out of the reservoir, you really end up stranding a resource or making it so costly to get out that the price will have to rise to a much higher level in order to make it economic to get it out.
Deciding which resource takes precedence over another presented the first major dilemma for the new Conservation Board. It is an issue that just won't go away. Energy and Utilities Board Chairman Neil McCrank meets regularly with his predecessors, including Dr. George Govier, who led the organization from 1959 to 1978.
I'm the most fortunate chairman of all of the chairmen prior to my term, in that I have a wealth of experience to call on to assist me in some of the deliberations. And one of the key advisors is sitting right beside me, and Dr. Govier, who has been involved with this board for some 60 years or so in one form or another. And you are absolutely correct in that the issue of the gas over a resource, over another resource, has permeated this organization for 50 or 60 or 70 years.
The 1920s and 30s also were witness to the development of another body that is now under the umbrella of the Energy and Utilities Board. The Alberta Geological Survey, variously associated with the University of Alberta and the Alberta Research Council, was founded by Dr. John Allen. Allen mapped the mountains and foothills, explored coal fields, and collected data on mineral deposits. The Alberta Geological Survey marks its beginnings to the publishing of Dr. Allen's The First Annual Report on the Mineral Resources of Alberta in 1920. Mount Allen, the venue for downhill ski events during the 1988 Olympic Winter Games, was named in honor of Dr. Allen. The Geological Survey, part of the EUB since 1996, acts as a clearinghouse for research and a library for the petroleum industry. Dr. Charles Stelck, Professor Emeritus at the University of Alberta, who graduated from there in 1937, has been associated with the Geological Survey for 70 years. Before seismic, paleontologists like Dr. Stelck would sit on a well that was being drilled, examining the mud returns. It was a daunting task prior to the computer age.
So we decided to do it by using micropaleontology, and we started drawing the little fossils page by page, thousands of them. As a matter of fact, you look at them, it takes 40,000 fossil identifications to make a book that size. But it did break the back until seismic finally took over.
The entire Alberta economy ground to a halt during the 30s, and World War II caused interest and investment in the petroleum industry to virtually disappear. Then came the first hint that major pools of oil would be found in Western Canada. The petroleum potential was recognized by Dr. Charlie Stelck, who spent the summer of 1943 working on the Canal Pipeline project for Imperial Oil at Norman Wells.
And there was a man called Boggs there, worked in South America, and he says, "This isn't a shale field, I think this is reefal." Reef in the Arctics? Everybody rolled on the floor laughing. Who ever heard of a coral reef in the Arctic? So my first job was to take a dog team and go out into the mountains and see if this was so. When I went out, I came back, and sure enough, he was right. There was a coral reef out there in the mountains. So when they shut down the Canal project, Imperial Oil had the idea that they should go looking for a coral reef.
That hunt for a coral reef took Imperial Oil first to Redwater and then to Leduc, but success did not come quickly. Aubrey Kerr, a noted petroleum industry historian and prolific author, graduated from the University of British Columbia in 1942 with a degree in geology. He was immediately recruited by Imperial Oil and spent the next few years drilling for gas in Alberta. Imperial had drilled 133 dusters looking for that coral reef and was about ready to throw in the towel. In the summer of 1946, the company had a seismic crew up from the States and one rig working in the Leduc area. When the seismic data turned up an interesting anomaly, a message was sent to Aubrey Kerr, who was drilling for gas near Provo.
But as soon as something happened at Leduc, as soon as they hit some indication of importance, the word was that when we got it around Christmas time, get the hell over to Leduc as fast as you can with your rig. And of course that took a couple of months to get over there.
People who would make a real difference in Alberta began to appear in Calgary at the end of the war. One was Dr. George Govier, a gentleman who would spend his entire career working for and eventually chairing the Energy and Utilities Board.
I remember working before I was a member of the board during a summer in 1946 in Turner Valley. And my assignment was to try to figure out a way to prevent the wastage of natural gas.
Dr. Govier recalls the original aims of the board are not very much different than they are today.
Well, first let me say it was small. It was a small organization. I think the aims have not changed very much. The purpose of the board was to ensure good practice in the development of the oil and gas resources and to ensure that there was good conservation. There was, even in the early days, concern for the environment, concern for public views.
Back in the early days, the Conservation Board was still struggling with oil companies in the Turner Valley field who were not easily convinced that they should cut back on production and to stop flaring gas. Unitization, pro-rationing, or market sharing, call it what you will, but the need to control production was one of the first challenges to confront the Conservation Board. Preston Manny recalls his father talking about the first chairman of the Conservation Board, William Canode.
We think conservation is a relatively new issue, but there was a huge debate. And Bill Canode was apparently he was a Texan, or at least I guess he was adopted Texan. I think he was from West Virginia originally. But he was one of these rough, tough guys that could deal with the rough, tough crowd that were running Turner Valley. And they say that when he first proposed these the conservation measures. He was going to shut down some wells, and of course some of the early producers, who were rough, tough guys themselves, said there was no way they were going to conform with some board order to reduce their production. So he'd get in his truck and drive down there and find the guy that owned the well and grab him by the shirt and say, we're going to seal your well, and if you touch those seals, we'll put you in jail.
I'd like to share old memories and talk about my hometown. She was a good time place through a little boy's eyes, so amazed at what he saw.
The late 40s would be marked by two important events: Alberta's emergence as a petroleum powerhouse, indicated by a major oil discovery, and a catastrophic blowout. In 1946, things were starting to happen in the Edmonton area. On the 1st of November, Imperial announced its intention to drill some unexplored territory near Leduc. Aubrey Kerr had made it over there with his rig and was looking for wet gas. The ball game completely changed when Leduc number 1 reached the D2 formation and struck an enormous pool of oil.
Well, first of all, Imperial tried to keep it all quiet. And they did pretty well until they put the well on production. Then they got publicity then.
That swooshing sound you just heard was the Imperial Oil Limited's #1 well at Leduc, Alberta, coming into production. The oil started flowing under its own pressure at 4 o'clock this afternoon, Thursday, February 13th, in what may be a momentous occasion in the oil world.
Edmonton radio reporter Hal Yurksa was on the spot, along with other members of the media, to cover the story of an oil discovery at Leduc. He didn't know then that he was standing on a pool containing 200 million barrels of recoverable oil, which, along with other pools in the area, would eventually feed more than 1,000 wells. The late Carl Nicholl was there too, writing for his daily oil bulletin.
The discovery of Leduc marked the first discovery of a major oil field in Western Canada since the discovery of oil in Turner Valley back in 1936.
Did everybody at that time realize the importance, the economic importance?
Well, they did within the industry. The number of companies interested in spending money grew from 12 to 50. And the amount of spending increased from $1 million a month to close to $4 million a day.
Do you recall what the effect was of the Leduc discovery on the stock market?
It was spectacular.
It was
Aubrey Kerr wrote the definitive book on the event and recalled 50 years later that Leduc will always be one of the highlights of Alberta history because it was a true oil patch discovery.
It wasn't as if they just drilled a hole over here into the Mississippi or into the Cretaceous and got some oil and gas. It was going deeper and hitting this hitherto unknown horizon, which nobody knew was there.
Peter Louhgheed picked the discovery of oil at Leduc as one of the top 10 highlights in the 100 years Alberta has been a province. He quotes from James McGregor's History of Alberta.
Black smoke ring belched out of the flare of Leduc oil well #1. It floated lazily into the wintry sky, a smoke signal of amazing portent, a signal that altered the province's and future and entered in the oil era. Alberta had hit the jackpot.
1947 proved to be a good year for Alberta. December revenue from oil and liquids topped the $2 million mark for the first time, while gross revenue for the year came to $18 million. The Conservation Board, although short-staffed, played a major role in Leduc. They gathered up staff from other locations to keep an eye on production in that prolific oil field.
One of them was Nate Goodman, now dead, who was the key person that was sent up from Medicine Hat up to Devon, or at least what was going to be Devon, and look after the drilling of the wells. So this was going right along until the board received its most important role that it was ever going to take, and that was when Atlantic 3 blew out.
The next major event in the development of the Leduc oil field pushed the Alberta Conservation Board into the spotlight. In late 1947, General Petroleum drilled Atlantic No. 1 and No. 2, which were completed producing good quantities of oil from the D3 zone. According to Aubrey Kerr, Atlantic No. 3 was spudded on January 21, 1948, and things started to go wrong almost immediately. It took a month to reach the target depth of 5,200 feet, but the drilling crew lost circulation. The well blew out on March 8th, spewing 15,000 barrels a day of light crude.
In the meantime, Maroney was given from Imperial, he was brought over to take the well over. And this was under the board's orders. And the board seized the well in May. And the first thing Maroney did was he lined up 2 rotary rigs to drill 2 holes down to coincide, it's all in here, to coincide with the D3, which was causing the problem. And he was in charge of that. And this was all done under the board's orders. And that was the most important job that they ever had to do. And then finally in September, they brought the well under control. But in the meantime, Labor Day, the well had caught fire.
The fire had both a positive and negative effect. The flames were extinguished within a matter of days, but the film of the blazing well was shown around the world in movie theater newsreels, planting a permanent image of Alberta, Canada as a major producer of petroleum. The next few years were uneventful, except for one major discovery of oil or gas after another, and the construction of several major pipelines to take it to market. There was Redwater, Golden Spike, Pembina, Swan Hills, and the interprovincial pipeline to Superior, Wisconsin, and later to Sarnia, and the Trans Mountain oil pipeline to the west coast. All of this conventional oil production had a somewhat negative effect on development of the tar sands near Fort McMurray, but a handful of companies, along with the Alberta Research Council, persevered with small pilot projects. They included City Service Athabasca, later to become Syncrude, and Great Canadian Oil Sands. Mining experiments at Mildred Lake were being carried out with cats pushing the oil sand into piles, which were scooped up by a small bucket wheel. That idea was based on giant equipment in use in a German coal mine. Commercial operations would have to decide later between bucket wheels and conveyor belts, or giant shovels and trucks. In 1960, as the hunt for oil and gas continued to expand in Alberta, the ERCB decided to create and maintain a complete history of drilling activities. 2 years later, it opened the first core storage center. In 1982, it opened the massive Core Research Center that houses the largest inventory of geological material in the world, one sample of drill cuttings dating back to 1911. This warehouse contains 1.2 million boxes of core samples that are readily available to industry specialists and the general public for examination. In another part of the building, trays containing vials of drill cuttings are stored in neat rows, waiting to be examined. There are 15 million vials contained in 250,000 trays. One can be located and delivered to one of 50 specially equipped cubicles for close examination in minutes. In 1962, when Dr. Govier was deputy chairman, the Conservation Board approved the first application for a commercial oil sands plant. Great Canadian Oil Sands, later to become Suncor, made the first plunge into the production of synthetic oil from bitumen.
I recall the original application, which I think was for a project to produce 25,000 barrels a day. Later, I believe, amended to 35,000 barrels a day. So there was concern that if the oil sands project took a big share of the market, then the conventional producers would suffer. And there was actually some considerable opposition to the development of the oil sands on the grounds that it might deprive the conventional producers of their market.
5 years later, on October the 2nd, 1967, the first commercially produced bitumen oozed over the edge of a huge tank at Great Canadian Oil Sands. It was a satisfying moment for a bold and visionary company that had struggled for many years to refine its extraction methods and to acquire or construct the equipment it needed.
Well, my first experience in dealing with oil sands was actually 1970 and 1971 as a summer student working for Great Canadian Oil Sands here in Fort McMurray.
Harry Lillo retired in 2005 as executive manager of the Fort McMurray office of the Alberta Energy and Utilities Board. He had worked his way up from the ground at GCOS all the way to the top of the EUB office.
I worked on the blasting crew for one summer where we were blasting overburden, not overburden, but rather blasting the oil sands to fluff it up. So when the bucket wheels came in and dug in the winter time, it was easier for those machines to dig.
Yeah, I do remember my first day. I started in Black Diamond, in the field office in Black Diamond. Area supervisor at that time, Chuck Moore, he took me into the back, and there's this bullpen, and probably wasn't as big as this room, and there was 6 desks, and all the filing cabinets, and the coffee station, and that was my home for 4 years.
Even after 7 decades, there is still disagreement over where the important work is done, here in head office in Calgary or in field offices around the province. Dwayne Wiseman started his career with the board in 1975. When he rose to executive manager of the field surveillance branch, he developed a plan to make sure the various chairmen of the board, Frank Mink, Phil Prince, and Celine Belanger, all got their boots dirty. The dangers of drilling for sour gas near population centers had not yet appeared on the Alberta radar screen. Not until enormous quantities of high-pressure gas were discovered southwest of Edmonton. Even a major blowout at an Amoco gas well in the West Pembina field in 1977 that sent the rotten egg smell of H2S into Edmonton and beyond the borders of Alberta didn't cause much public reaction. The incident was so serious, it required the expertise of Red Adair to bring the first lodgepole blowout under control. Dave Agnew was the board's man on the scene.
It went from December 6th to, I think, January 2nd. And it caught fire on Christmas Eve. And from December 6th to Christmas Eve, it from Lodgepole to Cynthia to Drayton Valley to even as far as south as Montana, people could smell sour gas. You know, it was that big a blow-up. And they had an inquiry in Drayton Valley. It lasted a day and a half or 2 days. It wasn't a big deal. And the public really wasn't involved to any great extent.
1978 was a busy year. It saw the appointment of a new breed of chairman of the Conservation Board. Former Chairman DeSorcy says Vern Millard proved himself to be a fine communicator who reached out to the public and took the ERCB from total obscurity into a new era of collaboration involving industry and the ERCB, and for the first time, environmentalists.
It was the 70s when we came into a new era, and some of us at the board, some of the people even older than I, just couldn't adjust to it. Quite frankly, Murray, many of us reacted along the lines that, well, we've been looking after these things for years. We've been concerning ourselves, gosh, we have the best blowout prevention regulations in the world, and nobody cared. And all of a sudden, we have, you know, a great deal of high-profile concern. Vernon Millard, more than any other person, convinced me that this was a different world, and indeed we've had 30 years of proof that it is.
Vern Millard brought a lot to the organization, first as secretary to the board and then subsequently as chairman. He was not a technical man, but he understood the technical issues very well. And I would say above all, he brought matters of public concern and matters of common sense to the fore and made sure that they were given the proper weight.
In 1982, I was the assistant team leader in Drayton Valley, and my team leader was Ron Paulson, and we went out that very first night.
In 1982, the attention of the Alberta Energy and Utilities Board was once again drawn to the West Pembina area when another Amoco well blew out of control. This time, 2 workers attempting to bring it under control died at the scene, and Albertans suddenly realized they should be concerned about sour gas development near population centers. The second lodgepole blowout would have a major impact on the EUB and the public. Jim Reed is now the manager of operations at the Energy and Utilities Board.
Well, I think prior to '82, there were no such things as emergency response plans or planning for emergencies for sour drilling. So when this happened and went on for the period of time it did, and the complaints that came in, clearly this organization saw that something had to be done to investigate what changes were necessary to ensure public safety.
What forced major change was the fact the blowout was not far from the city of Edmonton. Hundreds of thousands of people were affected by the rotten egg smell of H2S and for the first time learned of the potential danger of sour gas production. Alberta environmentalist Martha Kostick says lodgepole was the critical turning point as far as sour gas production is concerned.
It's only when they tend to affect urban areas that the media gets interested. And when the media gets interested, then they tend to take on a larger a role in making changes. And the lodgepole blowout was one of those because it went on so long and affected so many people. I mean, it affected people all the way down to Winnipeg.
There were so many complicating factors. The odor of H2S irritating people in several provinces and states. Then the well caught fire accidentally. When the pipe rams were released, the pipe flew out of the hole and struck the top of the rig, creating a spark. On the downside, the rig collapsed onto itself, making the well control effort more difficult. On the plus side, the flame stopped the rotten egg smell. The ERCB field staff then made a serious call. They informed Amoco that because the rotten egg smell had spread far beyond the borders of Alberta, they would have to bring the well under control while it was on fire, a dangerous technique that had never been tried on a blowout of this magnitude.
It was Ron Paulson and myself and Bill Wiley, the main folks out there that met with Amoco and the new well control experts that came up, the Boots and Coots, and we made it perfectly clear to them that we want this well put out while on fire. So they knew perfectly well that if it wasn't going to be understood, cooperated, and agreed upon at the field level, we'd be having this conversation in Calgary with our board. And that was the kind of support we had. I mean, we were on the phone numerous times every day with the folks in Calgary, and great help and support.
The lodgepole blowout was brought under control after 66 days. The Conservation Board ordered a 2-phase inquiry into the blowout that extended even into how the board itself responded to the emergency. In the end, the inquiry lasted longer than the blowout and resulted in substantive change. Former EUB Chairman Gerry DeSorcy was a member of the lodgepole blowout panel. He thought that by the year 2005, the issue of sour gas development might have settled down.
That hasn't occurred. Sour gas remains a key issue, and I'm now satisfied it's going to remain a key issue.
On the heels of several blowouts and critical sour gas well applications near large population centers early in this millennium, there can be no doubt the level of concern remains high. In January of 2000, the Energy and Utilities Board created a special committee to address the high level of concern resulting from sour gas drilling applications near Calgary. All stakeholders, including representatives of the public, were represented on the Public Safety and Sour Gas Review Committee, which was chaired by Gerry DeSorcy. Amazingly, the Energy and Utilities Board undertook to implement every single one of the 87 recommendations of the Public Safety Committee and created a special sour gas team to coordinate that effort. Group leader Marilyn Craig says that decision marks one of the biggest changes in her 30-year career at the Energy and Utilities Board.
I'd say that we have day-to-day contact. It's just become a part of doing business now. We don't set any type of new policy without involving other stakeholders.
In its ongoing study of sour gas development, particularly near urban centers, the EUB Public Safety and Sour Gas Team is conducting tests to establish how quickly a drilling rig can be evacuated and a sour gas well ignited in the event of a blowout. These tests will help establish new regulations and to help define the size of emergency planning zones. There was some concern in 1995 when the Alberta government decided to merge the Public Utilities Board with the then Energy and Resources Conservation Board. According to Brad McManus, a member of both boards, the 30 or so employees of the PUB feared they would be swallowed up by the 600 employees of the ERCB. However, history has shown that did not occur.
The name of the organization, of course, is the Energy and Utilities Board. So they're sort of given equal billing. I think if you examine the number of decisions which come out of this board, which is often from people outside the board, a reflection of what's going on in here, you'll see that by the nature of the applications, there's usually more utility decisions than energy decisions. So although the utility staff is still a small minority of the overall organization, I think there's a lot of work that comes out of that branch that's important. And of course, we're still dealing with the tail end of the restructuring, which commenced right around the time of the merger.
10 years later, with a regulated rate option still available, electrical deregulation in Alberta was being described as restructuring, but the aims remained the same.
Competition, I think, is the end game, both in the wholesale side and in the retail end of the business. And for end-use customers, small customers like you and I think the government policy is they want us to eventually make choices with the competitive retailers and move away from the default supply.
The credit for the extremely positive resolution to the vexing issue of flaring and venting can be shared among the EUB, industry, and environmentalists. In 1996, an Alberta Research Council report concluded that flaring was not nearly as efficient as had been believed, and thousands of small flames across the province were exposing Albertans to hundreds of toxic compounds. Flaring and venting of solution gases in Alberta was cut in half by 2001, according to the 1996 baseline data. By the year 2005, flaring and venting had been reduced by a further 25%, setting a standard worthy of worldwide envy. Remember the issue that resulted in the creation of the first Conservation Board? That was the huge amount of natural gas that was being wasted in Turner Valley to allow for the production of light oil. Starting in 1996 and continuing for the next 7 years, the EUB was once again deciding which resource took precedence over another. After numerous studies, reports, hearings, and legal challenges, more than 1,000 producing gas wells in the Fort McMurray area were shut in for fear continued production would depressurize the formation and reduce the amount of bitumen that could be produced in situ.
I've thought of it very frequently, how the board was created for a specific issue, and 60 or so years, 70 years later, whatever it is right now, the same kind of issue arose, almost at the different end of the hydrocarbon spectrum, but very similar in nature. And I'm pleased to say that, in my judgment, the board has approached the matter initially and recently, similar matters, with the same technical and precise kind of common sense judgments.
Looks good here. Right with you. You can shut that one off. Let's try that very first pumper again, please.
It's had its own way for 86 years, and we're going to give it the shock of its life here in a few minutes. It's just been sitting down here doing whatever it wanted to do for a long, long time.
And shock it they did. The Alberta Energy and Utilities Board undertook a massive multi-million-dollar project to bring a wild well under control. The historic Peace River well was drilled in 1916 under federal license and blew out of control when it reached 350 meters. All attempts to tame it failed, including relief wells that were drilled in 1955 and 1982. Until July 2003, the well spewed out 500,000 cubic feet of slightly sour gas and 30,000 barrels of salt water each and every day. The gas was burned off and the salt water flowed into the Peace River. The heavy equipment that was assembled by the Energy and Utilities Board pumped drilling mud and cement under extremely high pressures until the flow of gas and water stopped. The operation is estimated to have cost $5 million. Old Salty had been killed after blowing out of control for 87 years. The EUB hopes it stays that way.
I think we've got it abandoned as per the EUB standards, and we're confident that we've put that genie back in the bottle.
We close the way we began, talking about people and some ideas about the future. First, Dr. George Govier, who agrees with the suggestion that when it comes to staff, the EUB must continue to attract the best of the best.
That's well put. The board staff has to be at least as well qualified as the industry staff. And that means it has to have an environment that attracts these people.
We are really charged with looking after what I would call the crown jewels. And in order to do that, we have to have the best. And we have hundreds of engineers, professional engineers, geologists, technologists, technicians, lawyers, and in my view, my observation is that we have as good people in those positions, as good engineers, as good a lawyer, as good a technicians as anybody in the outside world. And the fact is we should have as good, if not better, because of our responsibility.
And now, a brief look into the future. Without exception, people in the industry are looking to the oil sands to provide Alberta's prosperity for the next few decades, and that is where the focus of the EUB will be. In 2005, the oil sands were producing 1 million barrels a day. That year, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers predicted that number would triple in 10 years, more than enough to replace declining conventional oil reserves. In 2005, China indicated its interest in oil sands production by investing in 3 projects, including a pipeline to carry oil to a West Coast port. The United States suddenly recognized the geopolitical implications of Alberta's oil sands.
I feel a lot more secure as somebody living in the United States, knowing that Canada is making these huge investments in energy security, and the United States will be a tremendous market.
What about the public utilities side and the geological survey responsibilities of the board? Will they be required to deal with certain change in the oil and gas industry?
We should always be a little bit on the forefront, trying to lead industry a bit, letting them know what the possibilities are, that the resources are in place.
The general public of Alberta that consumes the energy needs it in order to, again, that the prices that they're charged for both gas and electricity are seen as fair and reasonable.
I think, based on what I know today and using my crystal ball as best as I can, I think there will be a need for the utilities branch of the EUB for sure.
Jim Gray predicts there still will be lots of challenges for the Alberta Energy and Utilities Board 25 years in the future because there will be lots of activity in the oil patch. The price per gigajoule of natural gas could well be in the $20 range, and that will ensure continued exploration for deep gas.
We'll be looking back at 2005, 4, and say we were back in the Model T Ford era. And we're doing all kinds of different things, fracking, different kinds of horizontal wells, different kinds of all kinds of things. And so yes, it'll be a very aggressive, and the ERCB will have evolved and changed from today, just as it's changed in the last 25 years, to fit the circumstances of the time.
Jim may be right. We may look back on this as almost archaic, but I don't see any developments that would make the utility area totally free from any form of regulation. I don't see that happening.
The final words concerning integrity, credibility, and the paramount public interest go to 3 chairmen of the Energy and Utilities Board.
I believe that we can continue to place the safety of the public as the paramount issue, and yet also serve the public by recovering a significant portion, perhaps not all, of its, that is the public's, very valuable resource.
I don't think any discussion of the integrity of the board or the success it may have had would be complete without reference to my immediate predecessor, Ian McKinnon. Ian McKinnon was a former deputy minister in the Alberta government, but a man who was widely known for his integrity. And he made a stamp on the board that I think remains to this day. Everything has to be above board. Everything has to be done well. Everything has to be absolutely honest. And that's Ian McKinnon's legacy.
Well, and I think, Dr. Govier, you're modest, I know, but you carried on with that tradition, and I can recall speaking to one of the former premiers of Alberta, who indicated to me that when it came to the issues that were coming through the energy sector in Alberta, that he had full and absolute confidence in the position that Dr. Govier would take. And he said there were some that were so complicated he couldn't understand all of the details, nor did he want to, but if Dr. Govier said that was the case, he accepted it. And I think that's the credibility that this board has built up, has had over the years, and hopefully we still have.